All right, what's up, everyone from Calvinism versus the rest of Christianity? I love this group because I always get a good laugh from some of the posts. Now, let me just say this. I saw a post today by Michael Paul Clow, and this one was not only funny, but it inspired me to make this video to just answer some of these claims. Now, look, I'm not going to try to convert everyone to Calvinism. But if you want to have a dialogue and you want to criticize people, you probably should have like at least a half true statement, especially when you write an entire paragraph. Like, have one thing that's true. So let me read this for you and go through. Like, you're not going to get far with people. You're not going to convince the other side if you can't even accurately describe their belief. So don't using straw man arguments. But check this out. Now, this might sound good to you, but let me show you why it's so bad. I think even if you don't like Calvinism, you're going to probably see why it's bad, but hopefully I'm going to point out even more so why outside of the first line, there isn't a word of truth. So John Calvin, French reformer, 1509 through 64, wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion, 1536, former Roman Catholic who converted to Protestant system of belief and was the Popish Protestant prelate of Geneva, Switzerland. His Institutes of the Christian Religion became the theological authority which ruled over the populace. He was responsible for approximately 175 deaths, which was the result of anyone who would oppose his teachings. Deaths were burning at the stake or beheading, Inquisition style. One of his most theological theories is man has no free will to decide on his own accord. Everything has already been predetermined by God. So not everyone is entitled to receive Christ by faith. No choice to choose. God himself has already pre-damned people before their conception, damned from the womb. It's already been determined that you have no free will to choose, even if you desire to come to Christ by faith. Christ didn't die for all, making his atonement for the sins of the world only a limited atonement, which is the third letter in his Tulip theological treatise. Everything has already been decreed by God, including all sin. All right, so you might feel like there's some truths, half-truths, and just some probably fabrications in that if you're even somewhat familiar with Calvinism. But let me just show you, and I hope this helps the dialogue of the group. I hope if you hear this, you're like, okay, you know, I might not be a Calvinist, but at least I can understand their position and maybe get somewhere in the dialogue. That would be, if anything comes from this, that would be a blessing to me, to just see some real conversation happen, because I've followed this group for quite some time, and it's very rare that someone actually has a genuine conversation or gets anywhere in conversation, because there's so much bad ideas, sometimes on both sides. But I find that the people that hold these positions, as Michael does, usually has probably read some book or just picked up ideas somewhere that I know growing up at Calvary Chapel, I picked up a lot of ideas about Calvinism, and it wasn't until I met a Calvinist, and then I wasn't a Calvinist at this point, but I'd go back and I'd share with my Calvary guys, well, they wouldn't exactly say that, they'd share it like this and they'd share it like that. And over time, as I played devil's advocate for my friend, I kind of was like, well, shoot, I don't, you know, none of them can answer that, and I can't answer that, so maybe that's a good point, but that's another discussion. But let's start off with Michael's post. So John Calvin, the French reformer, 1509 through 64. That will be the only true statement in this whole paragraph. So the first line is good. Next line, wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion, 1536. There's not a period there, so that's kind of partially true, but he actually wrote, I think, like 8 editions. So we shouldn't think of the Institutes as like a single book at a single point in time. He added to them over time. He was trying to convey proper theology, and he kept adding to this work. And it's interesting to note that the doctrine of predestination and the decree of God, these topics aren't addressed until you know, a few editions in. So this isn't like this is all he wrote about, or it was like the foundation of his work. These things were added later as we're dealing with more and more topics and deeper discussions. Former Roman Catholic who converted to Protestant. At this time, well, yeah, Roman, this is what they call anachronism. So there was no such thing as Roman Catholic at this point in time. That was a term by the Puritans used pejoratively against Catholics, or they would simply call them, you know, followers of the Pope, Popish, or Romish, things of that nature, but that no one would call themselves Roman Catholic. So we use that term today, but no one would have understood that term back then. So he didn't convert from Roman Catholicism to Protestant, or Protestantism would be the proper way to say that. Rather, he saw himself as a Catholic. They believed in the Catholicity of the church. That just simply means universal. He felt that the Pope and his doctrines had corrupted Catholicism. So the Protestants aren't trying to start a new religion. They're protesting certain abuses, such as indulgences and certain practices by the Pope and other clergy. So they would have seen themselves as Catholic. They would have just seen the Pope and others as apostatizing from the true faith. Prelate of Geneva, Switzerland. That's just not true at all. Interesting, if you read the history of Calvin, it's interesting because he's passing through Switzerland. He's being chased out. They're wanting to kill him because he starts writing on religion and disagrees with the Pope. So the Catholics want to kill him. He plans to stay in Switzerland, Geneva, for one night. And there's another Protestant pastor, reformer, we should probably better call him. Protestant is probably a term that was given later, but a reformed pastor there, whose name's slipping my William Farel, and he basically convinces Calvin to stay, and basically says, God, this is what God has ordained, that you'd stay, and God's going to judge you if you don't stay. And Calvin really doesn't want to stay. He doesn't want to be there. He feels God has called them to write and to be a scholar for the church, not a pastor. He doesn't want to be a local pastor. But Farel, he feels that Farel put the fear of God in him, if you will, and maybe Farel is right. And although he has no desire to stay and pastor in Geneva, he does. And he does so for 3 years. And again, he has no role as mayor or city council or prelate. In fact, it gets to a point where him and Farel's reforms start to be bad for business. Brothels, bars, things like this aren't doing as well. And they kick Calvin out. They literally kick him out of the city because, again, it was a very licentious city, and having religious reform in which people actually start to believe, they're not just going to mass and saying a prayer and then going to the brothel after service. They actually start to be transformed and believe what they say. And it was bad for business, so they kick them out. And it's only after a Roman Catholic priest comes through and tries to woo the city back to Catholicism that Calvin agrees to come back, because they beg him. They're like, okay, we don't want to go back to Rome. We don't want to be under the Pope. There's some governmental power plays here going on, and they see this priest coming in who's starting to win the people back over as, we'd probably rather have Calvin than this guy, because if we go back to Rome, now they're going to put us back under a church-state government, because in Geneva and in Protestant countries, you had really a separation of church and state. That's what Calvin is known for. We think of separation of church and state in today's world as being a modern phenomenon, but that's taking the church out of the state. What Calvin fought for was taking the state out of the church. He didn't want the state to have a say in how the church operated, and they didn't like this. Even after he came back, he agreed to come back. He came, he debated the Catholic priest. The guy left, kind of refuted and destitute, and realizing he had no argument against Calvin. So he comes back to pastor, and he makes a long list. One of them is that he would get a good amount of wine to come back for the city council, which is a very funny story, right? You know, like, hey, part of my demands, part of my pay is I got to have some good wine if you're going to expect me to come back there and be in Geneva. I'm from France, and that's another story. So he goes back in, but even then he's fighting the city council tooth and nail for the rest of his life. He wants to do weekly communion. The city council says no. They won't let him, so he has to do monthly communion. And so he fights to keep the state out of the church, but at that point in time, remember, they're coming from Roman Catholicism, where church state is very merged, and so this was something Calvin didn't win at. But he has no political power in the city. He was a pastor that might have had some social sway, but he's not a prelate, he's not a pope, he has no sway. He has no legal authority in the city. So whenever people bring this up and call him a Protestant pope, or say he killed people like this is going to assert, it's stupid, because it'd be like your priest, somebody being executed in California today from a certain city. Let's say Stockton, California, we have a prisoner who's executed, and that priest who's at his execution gets blamed for the execution, right? It'd be stupid, right? And that's kind of what we're doing here with Calvin. We'll get into that as we get down. All right, so his Institutes of the Christian Religion became the theological authority which ruled over the populace. No, it didn't. The Institutes were never used to rule over the populace, nor was any Protestant church document. The closest thing to that may have been in England with the Anglicans, because that was more of, they switched over to a church state model from Catholicism, just not under the Pope. But outside of that, you never have the Westminster Confession or the Three Forms of Unity or Calvin's Institutes, any of these Reformed doctrines be used as a constitution or a governmental authority. This is just nonsense. And it didn't even rule over the church. So not only did it not rule over the state, it had no authority over the church. Calvin's work has never had any binding authority over any Reformed church. The things that are binding in the Reformed church is the Westminster Confession, if you are British or Scottish, and the Three Forms of Unity, if you came from Geneva or what they call the Continental Reform, and maybe if you want to consider Anglicans in that branch, which is part of the Reformation, they have a different 39 articles of religion. So those would be articles that were binding upon the church. But Calvin's work was never binding, not only not on the populace, but not even on the church. He was one theologian amongst many. And he was, I think, a great theologian, and that's why his works have lived on. And he was even respected in his day, but it's not as though he ever considered himself authoritative. He just simply was the first to really kind of approach systematic theology from a Protestant perspective, from a Reformed perspective. So you have St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote a ton on it, but Aquinas isn't addressing the issues of his day or of Calvin's day. So Calvin's kind of writing and saying, let's modernize systematic theology, in the sense of we have a lot of new topics like indulgences, like the authority of the Pope, like now that the Renaissance is hit and we have the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts that we could read that they didn't have before, we're starting to question some things. So he's really trying to add to what the church has already done. He's not throwing Aquinas or any of these guys under the bus. He's trying to really add to their work with his institutes. He was responsible for approximately 175 deaths. Again, this is impossible because he had no civic authority, which was a result of anyone who would oppose his teaching. The one claim of Calvin being a murderer has to do with Michael Servetus. I don't know whether there's probably 175 people executed in Geneva, and Calvin gets blamed for all of them, I'm assuming. I would have to look up what stat he's even referring to there. But Michael Servetus had been condemned to death in Spain. So the Catholic Church, under the Inquisition, condemned him to death by fire. He escapes from prison, and he goes to Geneva thinking Geneva would tolerate him because Geneva was rather tolerant at that time. They entertained ideas. They let Calvin come there, so on and so forth. However, they weren't tolerant. So think of it like this, like a criminal who's condemned to execution in California flees to Texas, or Texas and flees to California. If California says, you know what, we don't really like those harsh Texas laws, so we're gonna not turn you back over or not arrest you here and just kind of let you be, that would be kind of like, well, what are you doing? This guy was a murderer condemned to death. He had the death sentence and he escapes and he comes to California, and you guys are like, we don't agree with the death penalty, so we're just gonna let him walk. Can't do it. Just bad politics, right? Everybody would be up in arms. So this is what you have going on. Geneva captures this guy and they think he's a heretic, but there's this political power play. They don't necessarily want to kill him, but they know that the Catholic Church is accusing them of harboring heretics. And this guy was a heretic. He had been condemned under trial as a heretic. So if they let him live, it's basically going to prove that they don't want law and order, that they're letting heretics live and thrive and spread. And so remember, the Protestants were being literally killed for their faith as heretics. So all these confessions they're writing are to prove they're not like Michael Servetus. They're not heretics. They're not denying the Trinity. They're not denying the Holy Church. They're not denying the sacraments. But Servetus is really denying all that. And so they basically have to set an example of Servetus. Again, doesn't mean I agree with it, but that was what the government ultimately that's how they saw it. They felt like this would be really bad politically. If they let this guy live, they might lose Rome might come in, and these other governments around them might come in and basically take over if they're seen as weak and lax on criminals, which he was a condemned criminal, condemned to death. So they feel, hey, he was an escaped criminal. We caught him. We need to carry out that execution now that he's here. And Calvin actually begged the city council to give him a merciful death, because they ended up burning him with green branches, which don't burn as hard. And I think that was a condemnation that came under Spain. So they just carried out the condemnation that he had received. And Calvin saying, no, you know what? All right, if you're going to put him to death, at least be merciful. Make it a swift death. Don't torture the guy. They didn't listen to Calvin, though, and they basically tortured the guy. So now Calvin thought, I don't want to mince anything. Calvin thought he was a heretic. And at this time, heresy was deserving of death. So it's not as though Calvin basically was like, no, he's a good guy, don't kill him. Calvin thought he was a heretic, but he had no legal authority to kill him or put him to death. All right? Did he feel he deserved death? Yeah, unless he repented, unless he, because he had wrote against Servetus and basically had already condemned his writings, and they had written back and forth. So Servetus thinks he's going to go there and convince Calvin or have this dialogue with Calvin, and Calvin's like, dude, you're a heretic, get out of here, right? But he doesn't have him killed because he doesn't have the power to have him killed. He has no say. All right. So one of the most beheadings, inquisitions. Now, I don't know that anyone was beheaded in Geneva. Maybe they were, but Servetus wasn't. And I don't. Again, Calvin has no authority to behead anyone. And if anything, the beheading would have been much more civil than the way they killed Servetus. So, one of his most theological theories is man has no free will. One of his most theological theories. Okay, I guess that's a philosophical, theological, not theories. You'd say theological doctrines. Okay, because theory is a little bit different. But one of his theological doctrines is man has no free will to decide on his own accord. Not exactly true. Listen to this quote by Calvin. No man is excluded from calling upon God. This is Calvin now. Calvin's words. No man is excluded from calling upon God. The gate of salvation is set open unto all men. Neither is there any other thing which keepeth us back from entering, save only our unbelief. So whatever we say about Calvin's view of predestination, you need to take that quote into account, because he clearly is not going around saying, we have no free will, we have no choice, everything's determined. That's how he gets characterized. It's a caricature of Calvin, but that's not the way he spoke or talked. When we're talking about free will, you got to set the stage in the construct of how they saw free will in the 1500s. Erasmus writes a book called The Freedom of the Will. Roman Catholic Desiderius Erasmus writes a book on the freedom of the will. Martin Luther responds with a book on the bondage of the will. When they talk about free will, we're not talking about the choice to choose steak or chicken for dinner. That's that's certain. There is a sense of, we would say, free will in that, right? But that's not what Calvin or Luther or these guys are debating. What they're talking about when they talk about the will is this will that's in us. Is it a tabula rasa? Is it a blank slate, as the philosophers of the Renaissance and prior had claimed? So we're neither good or bad. We're just free or neutral or a blank slate. Or is our will conditioned by something, whereas Luther was in bondage to something? And so Luther, Calvin, I would say even many Catholics would agree that the will is in bondage to sin. So it's not free. If it was free, that means there's nothing good nor bad weighing upon it. So even Roman Catholics say, well, the original sin corrupts the entire human being except for his mind. So he's able to reason to God through his mind. The Reformers would say, no, original sin corrupts everything with man, even with his mind. This is what we call the noetic effects of sin, that even man's thinking is deterred and harmed by sin. So when we're saying there's no free will, and when Calvin's saying this, he's saying ultimately the wills within us are bent towards sin. It's not free, it's not neutral. we have an original sin, and we desire sin, not holiness and righteousness. We little children don't just come out of the womb praising God, right? They're greedy and they say mine. So that's what when Calvin's denying free will, that's what he's denying. Okay, not just that we make no moral choices. He would not deny that, and the reformers would not deny that we don't have moral culpability. Unbelief is what keeps us from God, not God saying, no, you can't come to me. But let's read this next line now, explain a little more. Everything has already been predetermined by God. So that's where I think the misunderstanding comes in, is because they believe that everything is predetermined. Therefore, God will rule over your actions somehow. So you might want to say, I want to love Jesus. You know what? I really want to serve God and love God. But God says, you know what? No, I didn't pick you, Bill. Sorry. So then, you're over here trying to love God, but God won't let you and damns you to hell. No, that's not how they saw it. They do believe in God having sovereignty, meaning he knows the beginning from the end. And so even if you're an Arminian or a non-Calvinist, right? If you believe, and this is what usually we'll say, God didn't make the future or plan the future or dictate the future. He just knows the future, okay? Even if you believe that, you believe in predestination, because if God knows the future and does not change it, does not actively change it, what is the difference between God causing or God allowing? If he knows beforehand and doesn't change it, things are predestined. So you can't get around predestination, right? It's just whether you get into how much of God is active and how much of God is passive. So the Reformed doctrine is God actively saves sinners. He calls them and regenerates their heart, and he passes over some or leaves them in their sin. He could leave everyone in sin. He doesn't have to save anyone. But apart from God softening a person's heart, they won't come to God. Now, there are those, they're sometimes called hyper-Calvinists or high Calvinists, who have a view called equal ultimacy, that God basically not only calls the elect, but he damns the reprobate in the same way. This isn't the standard Reform view. Some have held it, but this is a thing for another debate. I guess when it comes to Calvin, he never specifically specifies and really argues that out. So it's people after Calvin that kind of say, well, Augustine, because Calvin really just brings up Augustine's thought and makes it popular again. So for Augustine is what we call a single predestination. God predestines, the elect, but by predestining, we mean God works upon their heart and draws them to himself, and others, he allows them to remain in their sin, but it's in accord with their will. They desire to remain in sin. They desire to reject the gospel. They choose to reject the gospel. All right. And then there's others who, even those that believe in a double predestination or an equal ultimacy, those aren't the exact same thing, but that God would damn people. No one believes it's against their will. So even in the damning, God is giving a person what they want. Now, again, to be clear, the historic Reform creeds, which come after Calvin and from Calvin's thought, are not equal ultimacy. They're not a double predestination, if you want to use that term, which I think equal ultimacy is a better term, because double predestination could be defined different ways. But the idea is that the creeds are clear that God passes over some. So there's a passivity towards God. He doesn't act to do certain things, and I don't know that anyone would deny that at least some aspect of that, right? He doesn't stop every murder from happening. He could, but why doesn't he, right? So I think the Arminian or non-Calvinist is in the same boat here of saying, why doesn't God actively stop things, right? But in his providence, right, he allows mankind to act in wickedness, but there's a day in which mankind will have to stand before God and answer for that. So not everyone is entitled to receive Christ by faith. Again, this is not true. Calvin and the Reformers would always teach that Christ's death is powerful enough to save all mankind, but it's only efficient or efficacious for the elect, but they define the elect by those who have faith in Christ. So don't think of this as just some random picking or choosing, but to say those who exhibit faith, those are elect in Christ, because Christ is the true elect of Israel, and all those who exhibit faith in Christ are the elect. So not everyone will be saved, that's universalism, but everyone who is saved will be saved in Christ. No choice to choose. Again, we've already just, this doesn't have to do with choice. This has to do with how can a man be saved or come to God. God must first draw him, is what Calvin says. This doesn't have to do with like what I'm going to eat for dinner or who I like or love or marry. Those are all choices we make, and we're going to be judged for good and bad choices. I don't think steak or chicken is one thing we'll be judged for, but you get the point, right? That we have, Calvin doesn't deny free moral agency, but he just denies that our wills are neutral or free in that philosophical sense, not in everyday choice sense. God himself has already pre-damned people before even their conception, damned from the womb. I think we've kind of answered how the Reformed and Calvin viewed it, and that's not really true. It's already been determined that you have no free will to choose, even if you desire to come to Christ by faith. They would definitely reject that statement, right? They'll say, everyone, if you have a desire to come to Christ, it's because God has softened your heart. So no one is going to want to come to Christ and not be able to. So this, again, is another falsehood. In fact, Calvin and others were very clear to repudiate such ideas in their writings, which is why I say, if you're going to criticize Calvin, at least read Calvin. At least read firsthand sources about Calvin. Don't just listen to, crazy Southern Baptist guys or whoever you heard online talk about Calvin that haven't read Calvin themselves. The Dark Side of Calvinism, I remember reading by, a long time ago, and it was just terrible straw mans in there, and it's kind of like so many people read this book. The guy had passed away now, and he was an okay apologist, actually, which was sad because you have a guy that's like somewhat scholarly, and then he's writing this book, The Dark Side of Calvinism, and just totally misrepresents Calvinism. And this is from a scholar. So, if you have that bad kind of literature out there, it just grows and grows to where then the average person on Facebook is just putting out complete absurdities on the topic. Christ didn't die for all. So again, if Christ died for all, then all would be saved. So Christ's death makes salvation possible for all, but was the blood of Christ applied to every person? If it was, everyone would be saved. So when Calvin is saying Christ didn't die for all, he means the blood of Christ is not efficaciously applied to their sins because they have not repented and turned to Christ. So even the Arminian and non-Calvinist doesn't believe, they limit the atonement. Okay, we all believe in a limited atonement unless we're universalists. It's just, what is it limited on? Is it limited on man's free will or God's free will or man's choice? Or, so the Arminian will say, well, it's like God reaches out a lifeline, but you have to reach back. So then they limit the atonement on man's choice or man's response. So again, we all limit the atonement, but it's on what basis is the atonement limited? Because unless you believe the blood of Christ is applied to each person and each person will be in heaven, then you limit the atonement, okay? You do. There's no way to get around it. It's just on what basis. It's already, making his atonement for the sins of the world only limited. We talked about that, which is the third letter in his Tulip theological treatise. Okay, Tulip isn't a theological treatise. Theological treatise would be like the Institutes, this long work. This would be an acronym. So his acronym, total depravity, unlimited or unconditional election. So total depravity is man is completely in sin, right? There's no part of his being, not that he's as sinful as can be, but there's no part of his being that hasn't been affected by sin. Unconditional election, there's nothing within us of why God saves us. So God didn't save us because we're better, smarter, brighter, anything like this. So there's no condition upon which God saves people within man other than faith in Christ. That's the only condition. So there's nothing, he's unconditionally saving mankind, not based on anything they've done. Limited atonement, not all will be saved, right? The blood of Christ is not applied to all. Again, we just talked about that. irresistible grace. If God has called you and worked in your heart, then you're going to respond because his grace is irresistible. Not that you can't sin, not that people won't appear to accept the gospel. Calvin preaches and teaches on the parable of the sower, right? Many come, but then reject it and walk away because they truly didn't have real conversion. But the idea is that if God is moving upon your heart, you're going to respond. And perseverance is the important part. Perseverance of the saints. That doesn't mean once saved, always saved. It means if God has saved you, you will persevere. So once saved, always says saved is the notion of I said a prayer, therefore I'm saved. Perseverance of the saints says I will persevere to the end. The true believer is not going to be found in sin. The true believer will walk in the ways of Christ his whole life. So that's the acronym TULIP. Calvin didn't make it, so it wasn't his theological treatise. This was made actually by Loraine Bottner in the 1900s, but this was a summary of 5 points of Calvin's belief system. The closest thing towards that would be the Canons of Dort. Again, they didn't use TULIP. They do kind of hit on those topics, but this is much later, so this isn't anything he created. So again, another complete fabrication of history. So that's it. Everything has already been decreed by God, including all sin. So I think we talked about all. There's a lot of repetition in here too. He kind of says the same thing just in different ways. So this last one we could probably work out a little more too, because clearly God allows sin, right? He doesn't want us to sin, but he has allowed sin for his purpose. So whether you're Calvinist or not, you have to answer that in some way. But this video is 30 minutes long, so I don't think we should belabor it anymore. But hopefully you at least have some understanding now of what Calvin believed, whether you're a Calvinist or not a Calvinist, and we can have some further dialogue. But when you post stuff like this, which is just absurdities, it's hard to have a conversation, right? You just don't want to take the person serious. And I don't think people are trying to be deceitful. I think this is what they truly hear. Okay, so that's why I want to say, hey, really read first-hand sources, read Calvin's work, and see if you come out with that same kind of feeling and understanding. Read the Reformed Confessions. The easiest one is Heidelberg Catechism, question and answer. Belgic Confession is a rather short one. Westminster is really long. Maybe you can read the shorter, but Belgic Confession, Westminster, Heidelberg Catechism, Belgic Confession. And if you really want to answer the topics of Calvinism specifically, read the Canons of Dort. Read the first-hand source. They spell out in great detail every one of these things which I'm talking on. And so it's not like these things are vague. I mean, they really go into great detail and length to explain what we're saying, what we're not saying, what this means, what this doesn't mean. So there really isn't any reason for ignorance. It's not like you got to read the entire works of Calvin's Institutes. The followers of Jacob Arminius challenged 5 points of Calvin's theology. Not all points, but just 5 points of Calvin's theology. And that's what the Canon of Dort or the Synod of Dort is. It's a response to Arminius' followers showing how their views are false and ultimately Calvin's views are right. But what Calvin didn't do in the Institute, which is to really spell out and break down every nuance and clarify every single idea from those who would misunderstand him, is done in the Canon of Dort. So take the time, read it, and I think we'll all be a lot better off. All right, we'll see you guys soon.